Defense of Lvov, 1918. Lvov is the largest city in the historical region of eastern Galicia. According to the Austrian census of 1910, 86% of the city's population used the Polish language and 11% preferred the Ukrainian language. However, Lvov was the only one in which Poles made up a majority of the population. In eastern Galicia, Ukrainians made up approximately 65% of the population, while Poles made up 22% of the population and were numerically superior in the cities. As a part of the Austrian partition of Poland, Lemberg became center of Polish culture and scholarship, as well as Polish political activity. In October 1918, two regiments consisting of mostly Ukrainian troops were brought into the city, so that most of the Austrian troops stationed in Lvov were ethnic Ukrainians. At the same time, most of Polish units in Austro-Hungarian service were sent to other fronts in order to avoid conflict between the two groups. In addition, the Ukrainian Sich riflemen were stationed in Bukovina and were supposed to join the Ukrainian troops in the city. The Ukrainian National Rada had planned to declare the West Ukrainian People's Republic. Between 3:30 and 4 a.m. on November 1, 1918, Ukrainian soldiers occupied Lvov's public utilities and military objectives, raised Ukrainian flags throughout the city and proclaimed the birth of the new Ukrainian state. The Austrian governor was interned. Colonel Dmytro Wojtowski became commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces in Lvov, which numbered 1,500 soldiers. Lvov was proclaimed the capital of the West Ukrainian People's Republic, which claimed sovereignty over eastern Galicia, Carpathian Ruthenia, and northern Bukovina. However, a large part of the claimed territory, including the city of Lvov, was also considered Polish by many of the local residents. While the Ukrainian residents enthusiastically supported the proclamation, the Polish residents, constituting the majority of Lvov's inhabitants, were shocked to find themselves in a proclaimed Ukrainian state. The Polish forces, initially numbering only about 200 people under Zdzisław Tatar-Trzeszniowski, organized a small pocket of resistance in a school on the western outskirts of the city, where a group of veterans of the Polish military organization put up a fight armed with 64 outdated rifles. After the initial clashes, the defenders were joined by hundreds of volunteers, mostly scouts, students and youngsters. More than 1,000 people joined the Polish ranks on the first day of the war. This enabled the Poles to retake some of the western parts of the city, while most of the city center remained in Ukrainian hands. Captain Masiński organized the defense of the city, and was de facto in command. Although numerically superior, well-equipped, and battle-hardened, Wojtowski's soldiers were mostly villagers and were unaccustomed to city fighting. Furthermore, the elite Ukrainian Sich riflemen had difficulty breaking into the city from Bukovina due to the intense resistance of Poles in the suburb of Kolpariv. Although their enemies were ill-equipped and mostly untrained, they had the advantage of good knowledge of the city, which proved vital in the early days of the defense. In the following day, the forces of the defenders reached roughly 6,000 men and women, more than 1,400 of them gymnasium students and youngsters. Because of their heroism and mass participation in the fights, they are commonly referred to as Lvov Eaglets. On November 3, a few units of the Sich riflemen broke through and entered the city, and command over the Ukrainian forces was transferred to Colonel Hnat Stepanov. However, a Polish assault on the main train station succeeded and the Poles managed to capture 2 Ukrainian supply trains, largely negating the Ukrainian superiority in arms and munitions. By November 5 the Ukrainians were pushed out of the western part of the town, yet the Polish assault on the city center was repulsed and both sides reached a stalemate. With insufficient personnel to man a regular front line, the front was stable only in the center, while in other areas only the most important buildings were defended. On November 11, 1918, Poland declared her independence, and the following day the first units of the regular forces of the Polish army under Major Wacław entered Przemysl, only some 70 kilometers away from Lwów. Believing this move to be part of the preparations to break through the Ukrainian siege, Colonel Stefaniw prepared a general offensive on the Polish-held western parts of the city. However, despite the heavy fighting that raged between November 13 and November 15, the Polish defense held out and the Ukrainians were repelled. An armistice was signed on November 18. After 2 weeks of heavy fighting within the city, a Polish detachment consisting of 140 officers, 1,228 soldiers, and 8 artillery guns under the command of Colonel Michał Karasyk-Tokarski of the renascent Polish army, broke through the Ukrainian siege and arrived at the city. On November 21 the siege was broken and the Ukrainians were repelled from the Lykhakiv cemetery, one of the most important areas of the city. The remaining Ukrainian forces withdrew during the following night, although they continued to surround Lvov from 3 sides. Chaos during the Polish takeover of the city culminated in a 2-day-long riot, in which mostly Polish criminals and soldiers started pillaging the city. The Jews were accused of cooperating with Ukrainians. 64 Jews were murdered and 500 Jewish shops and businesses were ransacked in reprisal, the Morgenthau Commission. After establishing order within the city, Polish authorities punished a number of people accused of participation in riots. However, heavy fighting for other cities claimed by both Poles and Ukrainians continued, and the battle for Lvov lasted until May 1919. After their withdrawal in November, Ukrainian forces had laid siege to the city, surrounding it on 3 sides. The only link between Polish forces in the city and central Poland was the railway line from Przemysl. Due to its crucial importance for defenders, constant fighting for control of this line was waged, at times including the usage of armored trains. In Lvov itself, Ukrainians started an artillery bombardment of the city on December 22, preceding the first general offensive, commenced December 27. This assault, and the following one from February 1919, were unsuccessful and Polish forces continued to hold the city. On February 24, 1919, a short-lived armistice was signed, based on the strong demand of the Entente's representatives, who arrived in February, in a futile attempt to reconcile the belligerents and bring them to an agreement. Fighting began again on March 1, 1919. Positional skirmishes between entrenched sides lasted until May 1919, when a general Polish offensive on the eastern Galician front forced the Ukrainians, endangered with the risk of encirclement, to pull back from their positions around the city and thus ended the 6-month-long battle for the control over Lvov. The Polish-Ukrainian fight for Lvov is sometimes referred to as the last civilized conflict. The civilian casualties were low. Also, both sides tried to avoid destroying the city's facilities and the most important buildings were declared demilitarized zones. Among them were the hospitals, the water works, gas plant and the energy plant. Local ceasefire agreements were signed on. The Poles lost 439 men and women, 120 of them gymnasium pupils, such as Antoni Petrkiewicz and Jerzy Witczan, and 76 Lvov University students. Most of them were interred in the cemetery of the defenders of Lvov.
We invite you to subscribe to our historic channel. Click on the black Pro Patria Poland team icon and subscribe. Thank you and see you soon.